Hello, my name is Danny Blank, and I would like to welcome you to this session. We're continuing on the subject of extending the growing season. And in this session, we're going to focus on farming practices, farming techniques that will extend the growing season. It's primarily those techniques and practices that will improve rainy season production. That's hugely important for farmers, that they achieve higher yields in the time of the year when their staple food crops grow best. We will also be looking at practices, those farming practices that you can use that can increase food production during dry seasons as well. In later sessions, we will be talking about the role of perennial crops and their huge importance in truly extending the season. So in talking about farming practices that extend the season, I'm going to break this session into several topics. And the first one that we're going to deal with is soil coverage and the huge importance of covering the soil. Covering the soil can take many forms in terms of use of mulches, organic mulches, or green manure. Cover crops will define that. Or also just the soil can be covered through perennial crops that extend their leaves over the soil all year long. And the next topic we'll deal with is soil fertility. This is something that farmers are dealing with all around the world. Farmers wrestle with how to get the appropriate nutrients to their crops. And this is so closely linked to yields. So we'll be talking about different amendments in that session. And then we're going to talk about, in the third part, systems of farming that involve both covering the soil and stewarding the land, and then fertility, which stewards individual crops. And so we'll talk about some systems, one in particular of farming that really embraces both. We'll also discuss how to improve more production into the dry season with drought-tolerant crops, and we'll mention a few of those. We will also talk about water storage and irrigation methods. And then we'll talk about a couple different methods for raising crops, vegetables, foods into the dry season, growing crops in sunken beds, in sunken fields even, or doing things in containers, such as abandoned tires, and how you can use tires to hold moisture in that they're closed and can have reduced evaporation or water leaching through because of them being confined. And we'll talk about methods for raising food in containers during dry seasons as well. So that's the outline we're going to follow. We're going to begin again with one really important principle for extending the seasons, for truly creating sustained and improved food production. And it begins with soil coverage. I really want to take a moment and talk about the significance of having the soil covered, especially in tropical settings. We call mulch God's blanket. It's something that we see evidenced in all of His creation. When you look in the forests, when you walk through a prairie or go even into a meadow, you will see that there is the soil is covered. There is leaves, broken grass stems or stems, twigs that have fallen and have created, we call it a litter or a covering over the ground. And even some of the most productive soils in the world, I should say productive environments in the world, like the Amazonian rainforest, have not necessarily the best soils, But because of that litter, because of that covering, God's blanket, they're incredibly productive and can produce some of the most biomass, the largest biomass in the world, these equatorial rainforests. But it has so much to do with God's blanket. I just want to go through some points on it, because I don't want to move on away from this subject too soon, because it can transform farmers' fields by covering the soil from the elements. When we destroy that long-term blanket, when we remove that resource from the earth, whether it's through deep tillage or burning or bare ground cultivation, we're removing this layer that now exposes the ground to incredibly high temperatures. It is more prone to dry out. Crops cannot go as long into the dry season. And so you don't have that extended season potential when the ground is bare. But there are many even greater problems that happen. It becomes a very hostile habitat for roots to grow. I don't know if you've ever been to a beach before, or just where the ground is completely exposed. It can be very hot to the feet. You walk barefooted, and the ground can be very, very hot. And this is not ideal. Plants do not like those high temperatures, nor do soil organisms. And we need to understand the role that these soil organisms that break down this litter, this layer of organic matter, and the functions they fulfill in providing valuable nutrition to our crops. So we must think of the heat that is created, the evaporation rates, the high soil temperatures that are hostile to roots, but also the hostile habitat it is for soil organisms. These organisms are constantly cycling nutrients to plants. When we throw down on the ground a banana peel, or we throw down the husks of a maize plant, in time, we see that they disappear. They go away. They may be gone in a couple of weeks. We don't recognize them anymore. These are broken down through organisms that are taking up those nutrients, storing them in their body, and then through the process of life and death that occurs in the soil, cycling those nutrients back into the plant roots and causing further plant growth. So when we destroy God's blanket, when it's removed through fire or deep tillage, we remove the food for these organisms. It's gone. They have nothing to eat. And so our soil life in the soil becomes greatly diminished. And this is very severe. One example of what happens is in a maize field, for example, if you burn the maize leaves and the stalks, there is no food for there is much reduced fungal population that would normally be there to break down those maize stalks. And so what then happens is termites will come into a field looking for food, and their primary food would be the fungus that is consuming the maize stalks. But in the absence of a high fungal population, you now have the termites desperate for food. And what do they look for? What do they get? They now begin to eat the roots of our plant, which is not necessarily their preferred food. And so instead of the termites helping us, creating tunnels in the soil, for which then the water will hit the ground and instead of washing off because of bare ground, will be stored into the soil. You don't have those benefits that the termites actually provide. They can actually increase the health of our soils. And so you lose with the absence of what we call the soil food web, the soil organisms. When you pull back leaves in a forest, you see all these insects crawling, mite species and all kinds of fungal strands. It's rich in life. In one handful of quality soil, there is more life in one handful of quality soil than you will find people on the face of the planet. It's unbelievable. What are they doing? What are these organisms doing? They are participating in all manners of life that can truly and do truly help life above ground. And so in the absence of these organisms, you don't have that complex network of organisms that create this transportation network, a whole city underground. So as I mentioned, when the rain hits the ground, often it will run off because the soils are more compacted when they're bare and they have less breath in them. We need soils not only with life, but with breath in them. Roots need air, and roots will follow the tunnels of the mite species. They will follow those canals that are made by worms, looking for more water, air, nutrients, space. So this whole transportation network is greatly reduced. Roots then become confined to a smaller layer in the soil, and the soils become more compacted, as I mentioned, and that leads to less oxygen in the soils, and that favors a whole different type of organisms in the soil. This allows for the disease-causing organisms to flourish. Those organisms that don't do well with less oxygen are the ones that are often the most damaging to our root systems. They cause diseases. You may have seen it when you overwater a plant. All of a sudden, the next morning you come to see it and it's laid over. Why? Because you gave it the habitat you favored the disease-causing types. But when we have the proper life and breath, and there's all kinds of life, good organisms and bad organisms, but we must cultivate a habitat that is good for the organisms that we need in our soil, and we create balance when we have the soil covered. Another problem that happens when we have bare ground is that soils become increasingly defined by their parent material, very acidic or very basic, and they have less nutrient holding capacity. They can't hold water as well because organic matter is like a sponge in the soil. It is the one wild card that can change. And so when that maize stalk and leaf is laying on the ground, it eventually becomes soil over time. And that acts like a sponge and it stores nutrients. So when we don't have those things, we have greater problems. We have certain toxicities that can develop. Aluminum toxicity and phosphorus, the element phosphorus becomes more limited. And so all these problems are huge. And hope then becomes described as the next fertilizer or lime subsidy. But God has made it such that the way that the creation works, it's never needed fertilizer. Trees and forests have lived so many years without intervention and prospered. And we want to mimic those principles that God has in place and that He has put in place for plants to prosper. So I want to show you some pictures now of examples of covering the soil. And so these are going to be systems that don't involve a lot of soil disturbance. They're not going to involve incorporation, plowing over organic matter. They're going to be systems where crop residues are left at the surface. Here's an example in this picture here where you see straw and maize has been planted into it. Mulch is used in vegetables. In fact, at Echo, we use it extensively on vegetables, grains, roots, and tubers, and fruit and wood, fuel wood crops. We keep the soil covered as much as possible. These are some other examples that you're looking at now of beds that covered with mulch. And I want to show you an example of a farmer here in Mozambique. He was encouraged to consider moving towards leaving his residues on the ground instead of letting his goats come in and feed them. And so he actually sold his goats, and he had 2 hectares of maize, and he farmed it in a way that he left his maize stalks on the ground. And he actually did so incredibly well. He got over a fourfold increase in maize, or around a fourfold. I think it's actually a conservative estimate when we talked and interviewed the farmer. But he got a fourfold or more of maize in moving to no-till and no burning. I visited a farmer in El Salvador, and he had one of the nicest plantings of young citrus trees. And when you looked at the ground, it was covered. And I asked him what he had done, and he had taken his bean straw and gathered it around the base of the citrus plants. And they were in an area that only got 5 centimeters of rain over a 6-month period. It's a very small amount. And the soil was cool, it was moist to the touch. There wasn't this exposed, hostile environment, but the roots can grow closer to the surface and capture that organic matter that's being broken down and cycled to the roots. Bananas work incredibly well with mulch. In fact, they're the one plant that can handle incredible high amounts piled up in around the plants. And this is a farmer in Zambia who, during the long dry season, still had healthy bananas with extended leaves, not showing signs of wilt, and he used a high amount of mulch. We generally encourage organic mulch. Organic would be something that was once alive and is being broken down with some kind of decaying organic matter that could be rice straw or corn stalks or cut grass along roadsides that's been now placed around plants. But you can also use rocks. And in this picture, you're looking at rock mulch. And I've been in places where that is one of the most appropriate sources of material to cover the soil. As kids, I used to hunt for snakes and lizards and where I grew up. And we would always look under rocks because that's where the most life was found, where it was coolest, where it was moist. And so rock mulch in certain places where it's incredibly dry and you don't have a high amount of biomass production, rock mulch can be sufficient and can be a very effective way of covering the soil. Another way of covering the soil that I want to talk about now is the green manure cover crops. And these are crops that are vining, tend to be vining legumes that can convert the nitrogen that's in the atmosphere into a form of nitrogen that is useful for plants. And they smother the ground, they smother weeds, and farmers use them in very creative ways in their fields to cover the ground. I met a farmer in Honduras who used velvet bean or mucuna mulch. It was fantastic. He hadn't used fertilizers in 7 or 8 years and had this incredible way of suppressing weeds and increasing the health of his maize. The mucuna would be cut back, and he would plant then right into this thick layer of decaying velvet bean mulch. And it was beautiful. And when I first visited him, I saw the field from a distance, and I got out of a vehicle and I wanted to talk to the farmer because it was very innovative. And there weren't many farmers in the area doing it. And I walked into his field, and he was very excited to show it to me. Very small farm, less than a hectare, I think. And when I first opened up the soil on that hot day, it was cool to the touch, and there was an earthworm cocoon that I found in my hand, and you can see it in this picture, this earthworm cocoon. When I first opened up the soil to look, and it was right at the surface. If it was bare ground, and I was in a field earlier that day where it was bare, the farmer used slash and burn, and it was hot, there were fire ants all over, it was unbalanced. But these are less of a problem. There's more balance achieved when you keep that organic litter. And there's other ways, other crops that work as green manure cover crops, like pigeon pea, that you can grow with maize. In this picture you see from Zambia, the maize has already been harvested, and it's almost the end of the dry season, and farmers are still have their soil covered because the pigeon pea has grown up high. It's a high shrub, and they're harvesting the beans. And that is also another way that you can keep the soil covered. Now I want to talk about soil fertility. We just finished talking about mulching, and that is, I like to think of mulching in a way of stewarding the land, taking care of the soil. And that's how I like to communicate that. When we talk about fertility, we start to think about how to steward individual crops. And we're going to talk about manures, compost, and worm compost. Fertilizer can be a very significant way to boost yields, but they are becoming increasingly expensive and out of reach for a lot of farmers to get a hold of. And manures and quality compost have been used for centuries by farmers. And there's an increasing need to use these materials because fertilizers have become so expensive. But there is an additional benefits for adding organic fertilizers that synthetic fertilizers do not have. Aside from the fertility they bring, compost and manures bring in that needed organic matter that works like a sponge, that can hold more moisture. They tend to release nutrients slower, and so nutrients are more gently pulsed to crops. And so these are some advantages of using compost, manure, and worm compost. The FAO has a soils bulletin, and I like the name of the title. It's a free book that you can get on the internet, and it's called The Importance of Soil Organic Matter, the Key to Drought-Resistant Soil and Sustained Food Production. It's Soils Bulletin number 80, and it's free on the internet, and it really, I like the title of that book. It highlights the significance that organic matter plays, both covering the ground, stewarding the land, and now very strategic and very careful applications of these concentrated forms of organic matter, manure, compost, and worm compost near or at the base of plants. I wanted to show a few pictures of the use of compost and worm castings to extend the season. They provide, again, that needed organic matter that allows you to have a more water holding capacity. At ECHO, we found that in one field where we were constantly seeing our yields go down, we applied compost to the surface, and it was so dramatic, the difference that the compost made in the sorghum and millet plantings. Increasingly, commercial farmers, big-scale farmers, are using compost, and manures is part of their operations. A very good friend of mine in Zimbabwe has become totally dependent on the use of quality compost and worm castings, or worm manure, as part of his flour production that he then imports to Europe on a weekly basis. The largest tomato producer in South Africa, its production is based on quality compost. Worms are another way of providing that quality fertilizer to plants. They can accelerate the breakdown of organic matter by shredding it through their digestive system and putting that leaf and stock material or kitchen scraps, the onion peels, and separating it into smaller pieces so the bacteria can work on it more. We raise worms at different ways. I've seen so many different examples of farmers using worms. We raise worms underneath our rabbits, and it's a fantastic way to produce quality material. I've seen people raise them in small boxes. You're seeing this picture, a woman from Nicaragua who fed them, I believe, primarily kitchen scraps, but something highly nutritious like either manure or kitchen scraps, and the worms quickly convert that into usable fertility for plants. This woman here, in this picture, you'll see she was able to convert a large amount of kitchen scraps and cow manure into a number of sacks that she was then able to sell to other farmers as fertilizer. And here in this picture you see a photo from Haiti with tires, and the front tire is with the ring on it has worms being raised in it. And so for every 8 or 9 tires, they have one tire committed to recycling kitchen scraps that they then use with the worms in it, that they then use and add to around the other plants. And here you see the farmer who does it, and a handful of worms in his hand. So these are some important strategies: manure, compost, worm compost. We can't go into great detail about systems for producing them, but there is plenty of information out there, and it's just important that we value and seek after these concentrated forms of nutrients and apply them to our crops in very strategic ways. And I'm going to show you now in this next section on no-till farming, a system that combines both the soil coverage and a very targeted way to apply the fertility. These are some pictures from Zimbabwe where a farmer by the name of Brian Oldreeve developed a system, and he calls it farming God's way. And it's based off farming after what is seen in nature. And he used to be a farmer that burnt and tilled the land, and he saw that his yields were slowly going down, and his profit margin was getting smaller and smaller, and he knew that it couldn't be sustainable. And so he began to farm using a system of no tillage, leaving that valuable cover on the ground, and just combine that with some high standards. Part of the system that he uses is planting the maize in what is called permanent planting stations. And when he finished his career as a commercial farmer, he adapted this system to be really appropriate for small-scale farmers. And so this works incredibly well for farmers who just use the hoe. And there's no plowing or inversion of the land. And you can see this making of fertility stations, these permanent planting stations. And you can see now a picture of God's blanket, bringing in and covering that. And then every year, reopening those holes and practicing giving back to the crop and the land, and giving back instead of just receiving. Farming is a business. It involves inputs and outputs. And if you don't give to the land, if you do not do your part in caring for it, in stewarding it, you will see that in time it will be able to give less and less back. So every year is reapplied, whether it be fertilizer or manure or compost or worm compost or even termite mound soil can be applied in these stations in advance, during the dry season, in advance of the rainy season. Here you see a picture of adding manure into a fertility station. And these stations are well marked through a field. And you might plant 10 years, 20 years in these same stations. And they slowly get more fertile over time. And you plant into them, and you see the maize seedlings emerging from God's blanket. And this system has become so popular in southern Africa that it's even become the national policy in Lesotho. I encourage you to look into this approach, farming God's way it's called. It's available on the internet. You can find out more resources at Echo as well. But farmers have done really, really well with this system of both stewarding the land and treating it as a precious inheritance and taking care of their crops with these fertility stations. They are even achieving yields as high as 11, 12 tons per hectare in the tropics. And these are phenomenal yields that have been recorded. Phenomenal yields that far exceed that 1 ton per hectare, that 0.9, that 1.4 tons per hectare. These are huge, huge increases that can dramatically impact a family's well-being. The next session I want to talk about, the next section is succeeding with drought-tolerant crops. Now, this only works if you don't have roaming animals that are going to come in at the end of the harvest for, say, maize. But you can follow your main crops with something drought-tolerant, like we have a crop called the Hopi lima bean or 7-year lima bean. There's also lab. I mentioned the pigeon pea already. And then there's tepary bean, incredibly drought-hardy plant that just needs so little moisture to germinate it and to sustain decent yields. So it's really important that farmers think creatively. They can relay plant. That's last remaining days before the harvest. If their field is properly cultivated, they can succession plant and relay plant some very drought-tolerant crops that can provide added food production. I now want to talk about water. And water is obviously a critical element for increasing food production. And I'm going to just show several examples of water storage systems, and then we'll move into irrigation examples. Water is so critical for it going into the dry season. And so these are going to be pictures that these are going to be especially important during those long dry spells or dry seasons. It's typical for a farmer to have, say, a borehole, just a hole in the ground that in areas where the water table is high, or a well that runs very deep. And there has to be either a pump or way to bring with rope bring that water to the surface. In some places they use liners. I know this is in Ethiopia where they're collecting water during the rainy season with liners. There's also cisterns. This is in Haiti, an old cistern. You can see how thick the walls are. It's collected on the side of a hill, and the cistern technology is so improved that it's gone to very thin walls. This is also now in Haiti, and you can see how thin these walls are, made with very thin concrete or cement walls. And here you see an example of where I just visited just a couple weeks ago in Haiti, where they're collecting water off roofs and putting it into small concrete cisterns. And it's fantastic, only 3 meter by 3 meter, that they can use this water then to increase production during the dry season. Here are some more pictures of families with these water cisterns. So once you have this water stored, and you have to think really creatively about these systems for storing water, there are technologies for now delivering it to fields. The watering can is obviously one of the main systems been used, but there's gravity-fed systems running it through channels. There's more. There's technologies like drip irrigation that also work off gravity, but use these irrigation plastic tapes that can meter out water very carefully. You see this bucket irrigation method. Here's a larger barrel used with drip irrigation. This is in Ethiopia. And there is also in areas where the water is close to the surface, you can use treadle pump irrigation. This is at Echo, and then 6 weeks later you see the field 6 weeks after we set up the garden. And this is being used extensively in Asia and Africa. I visited farmers who were getting a whole second crop of maize. And you're seeing pictures now from Malawi where farmers are sharing pumps. I've seen farmers who rent 2 acres of land, and they're getting a whole second crop of maize. And this is fantastic. Prices are high. Production is low. But they're really able to increase this food production during times when there's usually shortfalls. And then the last section is talking about sunken beds and sunken fields, where you can farm in depressionals and getting your crops lower to the ground, away from desiccating winds, where there's increased soil moisture, where the rain can be concentrated, where the nutrients can also be concentrated. And so I have seen examples where this is really critical in especially dry places. And here's even a farmer in Malawi who even used sunken fields and had very high production. He actually grew 3 crops of maize a year by diverting water off a stream and carefully bringing it into sunken fields. And he had a huge diversity of crops. He grew the common vegetables like like cabbage and peas, but was able to grow crops throughout the year, like sugarcane and bananas as well, very well with this system. I did want to mention one more, and that is tires. You saw a few pictures of tires, and they are another way to actually increase food production during the dry season. Tires, you see in this picture, are from Haiti, and they are able to produce food with the water that's collected in cisterns and apply it during the dry times and increase their yard production. And this is very significant. And the tires allow it to be above the chickens and above the ranging goats. And so now you just see some pictures. These are from Haiti, where farmers have been able to increase their food supply, their home food supply, with the use of tires. So these are some important practices that we've discussed: covering the soil, stewarding the land, increasing fertility to the crop, and taking care of that, and then systems that combine both. And then how to be creative by moving into different crops that are more tolerant of dry conditions. And then for those crops that still need moisture, storing that water, and then creative ways for delivering that water to plants, and some systems for raising those plants in sunken beds or sunken fields or raised up with tires. And I hope this has encouraged you to think real creatively about options that you can employ in your own farms and around your own homes to truly extend the season. And in the next sessions, we will be talking about the role of perennial crops play in increasing food production. And this talk here was geared mostly towards those crops that are grown during the rainy season and those also that can be grown in the dry season. Thank you very much. And that is the conclusion of this session on farming practices.